Snow swept low across Bitter Mesa the moment the stagecoach lurched to a stop, and the veiled woman inside tightened her grip on her satchel as if bracing for another blow. Ethan Cole, cattle rancher, widower, a man who lived more with ghosts than people, stood rigid beside the hitching post. He'd sworn this marriage was business, nothing more. But when Lillian Hayes stepped down, small and trembling beneath a heavy gray veil, something inside him stilled. Not desire. Not pity. Something quieter, older. Recognition of pain he'd seen in his own mirror. Her voice was soft when she spoke his name, and the sound cut deeper than the cold. The veil hid her face, but not the exhaustion in her shoulders. Ethan nodded once, formal, careful, then took her trunk without meeting her gaze. He'd promised himself he wouldn't feel anything. Feeling had cost him once. Feeling had buried his wife. Wind rattled the stagecoach as it rolled away, leaving them alone in a widening silence. Lillian's breath hitched, almost invisible behind the veil. She wasn't crying. She was preparing. Ethan recognized that too. The town didn't help. Doors cracked open. Eyes followed. Marjorie Cobb watched from her boarding house porch, pity sharp as a blade. Sheriff Walter Briggs stood on the corner, jaw tight, remembering the fire rumor that had chased this veiled girl across counties. Lillian saw it all without lifting her head. Her fingers curled into her skirts, steadying, bracing. Ethan led her to the wagon. His movements were all angles, stiff, methodical, as if affection might strike him dead where he stood. Lillian climbed up wordlessly. Her silence wasn't fear. It was habit. A woman who'd learned not to draw attention to herself unless she wanted cruelty. They rode toward the ranch under a sky the color of iron. The land rolled wide and empty, fencing sagging, barns leaning, a place that echoed with Ethan's neglect. The house came into view, big, lonely, and aching for something it didn't have the right to want. Inside, dust coated the floorboards. A kitchen untouched. Cold hearth. Everything looked like Ethan, functional, hollow. Lillian set her satchel down and quietly began taking stock, her posture shifting from guest to worker in a single breath. Ethan watched from the doorway, taken aback by her instinct to fix what wasn't hers. When she reached for a cloth and her hand trembled faintly, he noticed. "You can rest," he said. More gently than intended. "I prefer work," she murmured. A simple truth. But her voice wavered, betraying the fear she tried to bury. He didn't answer. Couldn't. The past pressed hard against the walls, his late wife's laughter swallowed by time, his own failures echoing in every room Lillian now stepped into. Outside, a gust rattled the window. Sheriff Briggs rode past, slowing his horse, eyes lingering on the house as if sensing the fragile shift inside it. Lillian touched the back of a chair, steadying herself. Ethan caught the motion, the smallest collapse of her shoulders, and something in him leaned forward before he could stop it. This wasn't what he planned. This wasn't what either of them planned. But as the wind howled across the plains, Ethan realized one thing with startling clarity. Whatever this arrangement was supposed to be, it had already begun to change. The lantern light shook gently as evening settled over the ranch, turning every corner of Ethan Cole's quiet house into a mirror of the man himself, functional, hollow, waiting for something to happen without daring to invite it. Lillian Hayes moved through the rooms with her veil still drawn, her steps soft, almost apologetic, as though afraid the floorboards might protest her presence. But when she reached the kitchen and saw the thin layer of dust, her posture changed. Not offended, resigned. A woman who had spent her life cleaning up places she never truly belonged to. She rolled up her sleeves without a word. Ethan watched from the doorway, broad-shouldered, arms crossed, trying to remain an observer in his own home. He had brought her here under the guise of practicality, but seeing her quietly put order to his chaos made something inside him shift. His late wife had hated housework, hated ranch life. Lillian handled both like she expected nothing better. When she accidentally bumped a tin cup and it clattered to the floor, she froze. Ethan saw it, the way her whole body braced, breath held tight, like she was waiting for a blow delivered long ago. "It's fine," he said softly. "Just a cup." Her shoulders loosened a fraction. She nodded. Outside, the wind threw dust at the windows. Sheriff Walter Briggs rode past at a slow pace, glancing toward the ranch. He knew Lillian's history, the fire that had scarred her, the cruel gossip that chased her. He also knew Ethan's, years of grief sealed behind silence. He tipped his hat toward the window but didn't stop, leaving the house to its fragile reconstructions. As Lillian continued cleaning, Ethan walked the halls, every room echoing with memories he'd never voiced. The parlor still held his late wife's sewing basket untouched. The master bedroom smelled faintly of lavender she once favored. Lillian never approached those spaces, she seemed to sense instinctively which doors weren't hers to open. In the kitchen, Ethan found her quietly sorting through a drawer of tangled utensils. Her hands were steady except for one moment, when a knife slipped and grazed her palm. She hissed, more in embarrassment than pain. "Let me see," Ethan said. She hesitated, as if revealing her hand might reveal all of her. Finally, she extended it. His fingers were work-roughened, hers fine-boned but scarred from a life of surviving. He cleaned the cut gently. Too gently for a man who claimed this was a transaction. "You should rest," he murmured. "I don't rest well," she replied, voice barely above breath. That small truth hollowed the room. Near dawn, Lillian found her way to the front porch, staring out at the ranch's broken fences, sagging barn, and endless stretch of land. The place carried Ethan's grief like a second roof. She wrapped her shawl tighter, not from cold, but from understanding. Behind her, Ethan stepped out, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked at her silhouette in the gray morning and realized the house hadn't felt this alive in years. She turned slightly. "You're home, it just needs care." "So do I," he almost said. Instead he swallowed it. A gust of wind swept across the porch, carrying dust and the faint promise of change. Neither of them spoke, but both felt it, the shifting of something they had tried so hard to bury. And for the first time, the ranch felt less like a tomb and more like the beginning of something they didn't know how to name. Gossip rose in Bitter Mesa like dust, slow, choking, impossible to escape. By the end of the week, Lillian Hayes could feel it drifting toward the ranch even without stepping into town. The whispers traveled on wind and wagon wheels, the veiled bride, scarred woman, Ethan Cole's charity. And every word pressed a little deeper into the quiet places she tried to protect. She didn't tell Ethan. She barely spoke at all. She worked, scrubbing, mending, restoring what the house had lost during his years of grief. But silence wasn't shield enough. One afternoon, when Amos Calloway, the ranch foreman who'd once mistrusted her outright, returned from town, he removed his hat slowly, too slowly. "They're talkin', Ethan," he muttered, avoiding Lillian's gaze. "Mean talk." Ethan stiffened, jaw tightening. He'd spent years ignoring town gossip about himself, but hearing it aimed at her, this woman who moved like she expected punishment, hit differently. He muttered a curt thanks and sent Amos back to the stables, but the tension stayed in his shoulders long after. Lillian noticed. She always noticed. When she passed Ethan in the hallway later, her hands were balled into fists inside her sleeves, her posture smaller than usual. That was how he knew she'd heard something too. She tried to hide it by working harder. When she carried a full kettle across the kitchen, her hands trembled enough that the water spilled over the rim. She flinched, instinctive, as though expecting a voice raised or a hand lifted. Ethan rose from the table so fast the chair scraped the floor. "It's only water," he said softly. But her breath was already thin. In the days that followed, strange tension settled between them, fragile as thin glass. She spoke less, stood farther, always with her veil tugged close. Ethan wanted to ask, wanted to help, but the words caught in his throat. Caring meant risk. Risk meant loss. He'd lived that already. The turning point came at the mercantile. Ethan had ridden in for nails and lamp oil. Lillian followed quietly, refusing to burden him, though she clearly dreaded being seen. Inside, conversation died instantly. Marjorie Cobb froze mid-sentence. Two women near the fabric bolt stared openly. One whispered, loudly enough to pierce the air. "Why hide if there ain't something awful under there?" Lillian's shoulders stiffened. Ethan saw it, the smallest collapse, a lifetime of shame folding inward. Something in him snapped. "She came here to build a life," Ethan said, his voice ringing through the store, steady as bedrock. "She's under my protection. That's all anyone needs to know." Silence swallowed the room whole. Even Sheriff Walter Briggs, leaning by the counter, blinked in surprise at Ethan's unexpected fierceness. Lillian stood frozen. No one had ever spoken for her. Not like that. When they stepped outside, she paused at the wagon, breath unsteady beneath the veil. Ethan expected her to avert her gaze, retreat into silence. Instead, her voice emerged small but honest. "Why did you defend me like that?" He hesitated, the truth too raw. "Because you deserved it," he said simply. Her hands loosened at her sides. For the first time, she looked at him, not through cloth, but through presence. Trust flickered, fragile and faint, but there. That night, while clearing supper dishes, she lifted her veil just high enough to breathe freely, believing he wouldn't return immediately. And though Ethan didn't see her face yet, he saw something else, the trembling courage of a woman preparing to reveal a truth she feared would change everything. He paused in the doorway, watching her silhouette against the lamplight, and realized that what he felt was no longer duty. It was the beginning of something he had sworn he'd never let himself feel again. Night settled early over Bitter Mesa, the kind of cold blue dusk that made the ranch creak like an old memory. Inside the barn, the lantern flickered against rafters worn by years of Ethan Cole's silence. That was where Lillian Hayes waited, hands clasped before her, breath small and tight beneath the veil she had decided she could no longer bear. Ethan stepped inside slowly, boots crunching over old straw. He hadn't been prepared for the message she'd sent through Amos Calloway, the ranch foreman, a request to meet privately, where the house couldn't hear. He didn't know what that meant, but something in him already feared the answer. Lillian lifted trembling fingers to her veil. "I can't hide in your home," she whispered. "Not if I'm to earn my place." Before he could respond, she drew the cloth upward. The lantern caught her scars first, pale, ridged, running from temple to jaw. Old burn, old pain. The marks of a fire that had chased her across half the frontier. She didn't look at him, she braced herself for recoil, rejection, every response she'd learned to expect. But Ethan did not flinch. His breath left him, not in shock, but in grief, grief for what had been done to her, grief that she'd felt unworthy of being seen. "Lillian," he said softly, almost reverently, "this doesn't change a thing." She blinked hard, shoulders quivering. Hearing it was one thing, trusting it was another. Before either could speak again, the barn door slammed open. Clay Rourke, the drunken cowhand who'd mocked her veil in town days earlier, staggered in with two ranch drifters behind him. Their boots dragged, their breath sour with whiskey and spite. "Well, ain't this sweet," Clay slurred. "Charity Cowhand and his charity bride." Ethan stepped forward instantly, shielding Lillian with emotion so instinctive it surprised even him. "You three don't belong on my land. Leave." Clay laughed. "We came to see what the veil's been hidin'. Heard she's a monster. Figured we'd take a look." Amos, alerted by the voices, rushed in from the dark yard. His hand hovered near his belt knife. Sheriff Walter Briggs wasn't far behind, he'd been riding patrol and spotted the commotion. The lawman's presence snapped the drunken drifters to tense attention. "Clay," Sheriff Briggs said, voice cold as the wind outside, you just made a mistake, you won't walk off. Clay spat toward the straw, hatred burning through his fog. He's defendin' her like she's worth something. She ain't. Ethan moved. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply stepped so close Clay had no choice but to see what lived in his eyes, a man who'd buried a wife, a man who'd lived with regret, a man who would not, ever, let another soul wound the woman behind him. You don't speak her name, Ethan growled, voice steady as a rifle barrel. Not in my presence. Not in my town. Not ever. Briggs seized Clay's arm, hauling him toward the door. Amos drove out the others with a shove. Soon the barn was quiet again, just Lillian, Ethan, and the echo of danger that had nearly reached her. Lillian's breath shook as she lowered her hands from her bare face. She wasn't afraid of the men. She was afraid of what almost happened, of what losing Ethan's regard might have meant. He turned to her, expression raw. I'm sorry they saw you afraid, he murmured. You shouldn't ever have to be. She stared at him, veil forgotten on the hay-strewn floor. I thought you might look at me differently, she whispered. I do, he admitted. Just, not the way you fear. The barn, cold and hollow minutes before, seemed suddenly too full, of truth, of risk, of something neither of them had asked for but both had begun to want. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the last of the drunken men's shouts. Inside, Lillian realized she was no longer hiding. And Ethan realized he no longer wanted her to. Morning broke clear and gold over Bitter Mesa, washing the ranch in a soft light that made even the broken fences look hopeful. But inside Ethan Cole's kitchen, silence rested heavy between him and Lillian Hayes, an entirely different kind of quiet than the one they'd first lived in. The night after Clay Rourke's attack had changed something between them, stripped away more than her veil. Still, neither knew how to name the shift. Ethan found her by the window, hands folded, veil absent. She didn't reach for it anymore. Outside, Amos Calloway, his loyal foreman, hammered a new brace into the barn door, muttering curses about fools who thought a woman's scars were their business. Sheriff Walter Briggs had already ridden out to file charges, his conscience finally louder than the town's judgment. Lillian watched them work, shoulders easing for the first time since she'd arrived. They're repairing what was broken, she murmured. Ethan stepped beside her. So are we. She startled faintly, not from fear, habit. But when she looked at him, she didn't look away. The scars on her cheek caught the sun, and instead of flinching, Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Lillian, he began, voice low, what happened in that barn, it wasn't duty that drove me. He hesitated, the old fear rising, the fear of failing again, of caring again. It was you. She drew a slow breath, the kind taken by someone who'd learned to live small but was trying, bravely, to live bigger. I don't want to be your obligation, she whispered. You're not. Before he could say more, they heard wagon wheels crunching up the road. Bitter Mesa rarely moved early, but now several families approached, men with tools, women with baskets, children blinking sleepily. Marjorie Cobb, the town widow whose gossip had once cut sharp, stepped forward first. Shame lined her face. Miss Hayes, she said, wringing her hands, we misjudged you. We came to set things right, if you'll let us. Behind her, neighbors averted their eyes, guilt pushing them forward. Sheriff Briggs dismounted beside them. Town's got its flaws, he admitted, but it can learn. Lillian looked overwhelmed, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of being welcomed instead of shunned. Ethan glanced at her, silently asking if she wanted this. She nodded, barely. Enough. The yard filled quickly with sound, hammers striking, women carrying food to her kitchen, children wandering in awe at the ranch. Amos barked orders like a drill sergeant but worked twice as hard as any of them. Even the sheriff rolled up his sleeves. But it was Ethan's hand brushing Lillian's that anchored her. She looked up at him, breath-catching. You don't have to choose me, she whispered. I already did, he replied. Long before you lifted your veil. Emotion flickered across her face, fear, hope, disbelief, all tangled. It was supposed to be a business arrangement. And now? Ethan stepped closer, giving her every chance to step away. She didn't. Now it's whatever life we build, he said. Together. Her fingers slipped into his, small, uncertain, but real. He held them gently, as if holding something long buried. The hammering continued around them, a chorus of rebuilding. Dust rose in the warm light, swirling like a blessing around the two of them. For the first time since she'd fled the fire that stole her past, Lillian stood unveiled in front of a crowd, and no one looked away. Ethan did, though, only to look right back at her. With the kind of gaze a man uses when he's finally found the thing he never thought he deserved. And Lillian, breathing steadier with each passing second, let herself believe it. She had not been chosen out of duty. She had been chosen out of love.